gunshots rang out just as the choir took their final breath. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't gang-related. It was a mother, well-dressed, composed, and deadly, who pulled the trigger. And the person she shot, her own son, right there in front of everyone. But what nobody in that sanctuary knew was that she had just walked in on a manhunt. One that started with a hospital bed, escalated through a disturbing family secret, and ended with a daughter found cold, bruised, and barely recognizable in her own bedroom. And here's the part that makes this case unforgettable. Her son wasn't just on the run. He was there in that church for another reason entirely. One that would have shattered more lives forever if she hadn't stopped him. This isn't a story about parenting gone wrong. It's the story of what happens when evil grows in your own house and no one believes you until it's too late. In the fall of 2020, Julie Lead was admitted to Fulton Medical Center in Georgia after collapsing during her shift at a local school office. Diagnosed with severe complications linked to untreated pneumonia and chronic fatigue, she spent nearly 3 months under close medical observation. For most of that period, her teenage son, Martin, and husband John visited her sparingly, often citing work or church commitments. But it was her daughter, Sharon Lead, who showed up consistently, bringing groceries, asking doctors questions, and making sure her mother had someone to talk to. When Julie was finally discharged and returned home, everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. The house was clean, meals were cooked, and the bills were paid. But the atmosphere was unnervingly cold. John, once overly attentive, seemed emotionally distant. He kept to himself, often lost in his phone or tucked away in the garage long after work hours. His usual warmth and fussing over Julie's well-being had vanished. Martin, now 19, barely made eye contact. He responded to questions with one-word answers and spent most of his time behind locked doors or away from the house entirely. Sharon was the first to notice. Even before her mother could settle back into routine, she picked up on the energy shift. She was 21 at the time, old enough to remember how close their family once was. Family movie nights, Sunday church, and John's predictable way of leaving love notes on the kitchen counter before heading to work. But that man didn't seem to live here anymore. Julie, still physically recovering, tried not to overthink it. She attributed John's emotional distance to the stress of managing the home during her absence, at least for now. It was a Wednesday evening, just over 5 weeks since Julie had returned from the hospital. Sharon came home early from her second shift at the diner. Her mother was asleep in the bedroom. The house was quiet. Thinking her father was finishing up some work, she walked toward the garage to ask if he had eaten. The moment she opened the door, her world stopped. What she saw inside wasn't ambiguous. It was explicit, physical, and devastating. John Lead, her father, was romantically intimate with her brother Martin. They were caught pants down. She didn't scream, but she ran as fast as she could to her room in tears, locking the door behind her. That night, she didn't sleep. The image played over in her head, making her sick to her stomach. She didn't go to work the next day. She avoided both of them. Julie, still recovering and unaware, thought her daughter was just overwhelmed. 3 days later, Sharon finally told her mother. Julie was seated at the kitchen table when Sharon, in a trembling voice, recounted what she saw. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't soften it. Julie sat frozen. It wasn't just betrayal. It was incomprehensible. There had been tension, distance, but it wasn't even within the scope of what she feared. Julie stood up, walked into the garage, and waited until Martin came home that evening. John wasn't around. The confrontation was brief but unforgettable. She demanded to know if it was true, if he understood the gravity of what he was involved in. She pleaded with him to get help, to find a girl, to walk away from the path he was on. Martin didn't just dismiss her, he disrespected her. According to Sharon, who watched from the kitchen hallway, he spat directly in Juliet's face and walked off. No apology, no explanation, just contempt. Juliet stood still, wiping her face with her sleeve. She didn't follow him. She didn't call John. She simply turned and walked to her bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind her. From that day forward, there was no peace in the house. Julie and Sharon barely spoke to the men. John avoided confrontation, staying away longer and longer into the night. Martin became emboldened, more dismissive, more detached from anything resembling remorse. The warmth in the home collapsed entirely. Every hallway felt like a trap. every mealtime a performance. The illusion of family was already gone. The fracture wasn't silent. It was open, gaping, and bleeding under the surface. And though no one had yet packed a bag or signed a paper, the separation had already begun. In early February, just under 2 months after the garage confrontation, Julie Lead filed for divorce. The process was swift and silent. She didn't explain herself to anyone in the community, not the neighbors, not the church, not even her sister-in-law, who called repeatedly to ask what was going on. By the end of the month, Julie and her daughter Sharon left the house for good. They packed up their essentials and moved to a small apartment on the east side of DeKalb County. The apartment wasn't large, but it was theirs. And more importantly, it was far from John and Martin. Back in their old neighborhood, John wasted no time reshaping the narrative. To church members and old friends, he played the victim. He told them Julie had gotten involved with someone else during her hospital stay and that her mind had changed while she was gone. He claimed he tried to save the marriage, tried to pray through it, tried to be patient, but she was no longer the woman he married. It was a calculated story, dressed in sorrow and false humility. Martin stood firmly by him, reinforcing the lie. To his few close friends, he mirrored his father's version, saying his mother had lost herself and had been disrespecting John for years. When questioned further, he'd shake his head and say, "You wouldn't believe what she did." The church community, unaware of the truth, rallied behind John. He remained active, taking on more leadership responsibilities in the absence of Julie. Sharon was branded confused, and Julie was quietly labeled unfaithful. No one questioned why Martin still lived at home, even as a grown adult. No one dared to ask why father and son were always together, often whispering to each other in the back hallway after service. In their new apartment, Juliette said little. She went about her day quietly, started part-time work at a clinic near Lithonia, and rarely spoke about the divorce. Sharon, on the other hand, was visibly angry. The lies being told, the silence they were forced to keep, the weight of the secret gnawed at her, but her mother refused to expose the truth. She said it was too sick, too shameful, and too dangerous. Meanwhile, John and Martin continued their relationship behind closed doors. Without Julie's presence, there was no resistance in the house, no voice to question them. The secrecy only emboldened them further. The door that should have closed after the confrontation stayed wide open. And as John maintained his public image, few knew that within the walls of that home, a dark and unnatural bond was still alive. Quiet, calculated, and protected by a web of deceit no one was ready to unravel. It was a night that started with nothing more than loud music, cheap vodka, and too many bad decisions packed into one weekend. Martin Lead had joined a few of his friends at a private party in a rental home outside Atlanta. It was one of those gatherings where most people didn't know each other's names, but everyone had cash to burn and something to prove. The drinks came fast. The girls came later. The escorts arrived around midnight, 3 of them brought in through a local contact one of Martin's friends used before. It was a scene that repeated itself across many reckless nights. No questions asked, no precautions taken, and no second thoughts. Martin had no idea that one of those encounters would change the course of his life. Back at home, John had no knowledge of the party. Their relationship, already spiraling into disturbing territory, was built around secrecy. Nothing Martin did outside those walls mattered. As long as the silence at home remained, it wasn't until months later, long after the divorce and Juliette's departure, that the consequences arrived. John had begun feeling fatigued more than usual. He chalked it up to stress, the divorce, and long hours at the warehouse. But after a routine checkup for life insurance clearance flagged unusual markers, he was advised to take further tests. The results didn't just shock him. They shook the foundation of his already ruined household. John had tested positive for HIV. He kept it to himself for several days, slipping into paranoia. There were no women, no infidelity, only Martin. That realization sent him spiraling. When he confronted his son, it was not with words. Martin had also been feeling slightly off and, suspicious of the timing, agreed to get tested. The test came back positive. Same status, same result. That evening, as Martin returned from the clinic, John was waiting at the front door with a gun in his hand. According to what later emerged from Sharon's recounting and fragments shared during police interviews, John had snapped. He accused Martin of betrayal, of bringing something into the home that would destroy them both. Martin, stunned by the ambush, didn't wait to argue. He ran through the side yard and into the street barefoot, ducking behind parked cars until he reached the main road. John didn't fire the weapon. Whether it was hesitation, fear of neighbors, or something else, he held back. But the threat was real. Martin never returned. He stayed with a group of friends over the next few days, moving between couches. But once his status became known to them, the invites dried up. He was forced to leave. From that moment, Martin Lead had nowhere to go. The home he came from was dangerous. The streets didn't want him, and the weight of his choices, along with what he carried, would lead him straight into the next chapter of destruction. Out of options, Martin turned to the only person he thought might listen, his sister. He sent Sharon message after message. At first, she ignored them. Then, he began calling. She answered once, letting him talk, but didn't respond afterward. It wasn't until he sent a voicemail, sobbing, and asking her to at least tell their mother he was sleeping in a park that she relented. Sharon didn't want him back in their lives, but she told Julie anyway. Julie was firm at first. Her response was cold, short, absolutely not. After all, this was the same son who had spit in her face, the same son who had helped John spread lies after the divorce, the same son who by every measure had lost all regard for decency.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
But over the next few days, the calls kept coming, this time directly to Julie's phone. His voice cracked. He begged not for forgiveness, but for shelter, just a place to sleep, just for a few days. After several days of silence, Julie called Sharon into the living room and told her what she had decided. Martin would be allowed to stay, but under strict conditions: no access to Sharon's room, no visitors, no loud music, no disrespect, and the stay would be temporary. 1 week, nothing more. He arrived with just a duffel bag and avoided eye contact the entire time. Sharon didn't speak to him. Juliette barely said a word beyond the rules. The small apartment didn't have a guest room, so he was given an air mattress near the living area. It was a tense arrangement, but for the moment it kept him off the streets. By then, Julie had already started spending more time with Dr. Vincent Cole, the physician who had overseen her recovery during her hospitalization. He had reached out months earlier to check on her progress, and casual conversations turned into late-night calls. Dr. Cole, a single father whose son was already off at college, had long since stopped dating seriously, but he was drawn to Juliette's steadiness. Their connection grew quickly. Dinners turned into weekends. Juliette began sleeping over at his place more frequently. That left the apartment empty most nights, with just Sharon and Martin inside. Though Martin kept to himself, the silence in the home was thick. Sharon didn't trust him, and Juliette knew better than to believe time alone had changed him. But with her attention pulled toward a life that finally felt safe, she underestimated just how much could still go wrong under her roof. The prodigal had returned, but not for redemption, and no one in that home, especially not Sharon, had any idea what that 1 week would turn into. For nearly 8 months, Sharon Lead had been working 2 jobs. One as a cashier at a local grocery store in the mornings, the other waiting tables at a late-night diner. Her goal was simple: to move out of the small apartment she shared with her mother. Though she loved Juliette deeply, Sharon needed space, her privacy, and above all, freedom from the tension that returned the moment Martin walked back into their lives. Every paycheck she received, she set aside a portion, never in a bank, always in cash. She didn't trust online banking, especially not with the occasional stories she heard of people getting locked out or hacked. She kept her savings in a heavy metal piggy bank tucked deep in her closet beneath folded bed sheets and old shoe boxes. It wasn't much yet, but it was building. Nearly $3,800 saved in just over half a year. She never told anyone, not her coworkers, not her friends, not even her mother, but someone else. Found out. It's unclear how long Martin had known about the stash, whether he noticed her routines or whether he was snooping around her room while she worked the late shift. Only he could say. but sometime during Juliet's overnight stay at Dr. Raymond Vance's home. And while Sharon was clocked in at the diner, he broke into her room and took everything. The lockbox was gone. The clothes were rearranged, her folded sheets disturbed. Days later, investigators would learn where the money had gone. Surveillance footage, phone records, and statements from multiple establishments confirmed the timeline. Martin had used the stolen cash for a spree of high-end escort bookings over the course of the week. He traveled between private rentals and hotel rooms in Stone Mountain, Lithonia, and Tucker. Each encounter was paid for in cash. But the worst hadn't happened yet. The theft wasn't the final betrayal. It was just the last thread before everything finally snapped. The confrontation began late on a Thursday evening after Sharon Lead returned from her second job. Julie wasn't home. She'd gone to spend the night with Dr. Raymond Vance, as she often did, toward the end of the week. Neighbors would later say they heard raised voices. What happened next was pieced together through physical evidence, medical examination, and most disturbingly, a video recovered later by investigators. Martin had set up a recording device, one he either owned already or had borrowed, positioned carefully in the corner of the bedroom. The footage would show Sharon being overpowered, her dress ripped off, sexually assaulted, thrown against the wall, struck multiple times in the head, and restrained. She screamed, but the blows kept coming. At one point, the back of her head struck the corner of a dresser. After that, her resistance faded. By the time the assault escalated into something darker, she was barely conscious. She never got back up. The recording lasted over 20 minutes. It ended abruptly, the screen going dark. When Juliet returned home 2 days later, she noticed the smell before she even opened the bedroom door. She called 911, barely able to speak. Paramedics arrived to find Sharon's body partially covered by a bedsheet. She was bruised, exposed, and had clearly been gone for more than 24 hours. Martin was nowhere to be found. There was no note, no phone left behind. The air mattress he had been sleeping on was deflated and stripped bare. His duffel bag was gone. The door showed no signs of forced exit. He had simply vanished. Sharon Lead had spent her final weeks planning a life beyond the walls of that apartment, a space of her own, a clean slate. Instead, her life ended in the very room where she once folded blankets over a metal lockbox full of dreams, and the person responsible was the one she had once shared a childhood with. A formal manhunt was launched by Sunday morning. Detectives obtained a warrant to access Martin's phone records and social media, but everything had gone dark. No digital activity, no ATM withdrawals, no known contacts. Sharon's autopsy confirmed the brutality of the assault. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The secondary evidence revealed a far more disturbing violation, one that investigators confirmed had been recorded. The video would not be released publicly, but it was enough to lock Martin's name as the prime suspect. Julie fell into a state of paralysis. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She barely spoke. The apartment was cleared out within days by extended family, and she moved in with Raymond temporarily. He became her emotional anchor, helping her navigate the endless interviews, funeral preparations, and legal meetings. The question that kept echoing in the minds of detectives, friends, and Julie herself was simple. How does someone commit a crime so monstrous and then vanish without a single trace? Then came the phone call. It was a Sunday morning. Raymond Vance had just wrapped up a hospital shift and was sitting in the break room when his phone buzzed. The caller was an old friend from college who now worked as a church sound technician in Fulton County. The friend wasn't aware of all the details surrounding Juliet's family, but he knew enough from news reports to recognize a face that shouldn't have been walking freely, let alone sitting quietly in a church pew. "I swear, I just saw the guy they're looking for. Your girlfriend's son deserve right now. 3rd row from the front." Raymond didn't hesitate. He didn't call the police. He called Julie. He told her exactly what his friend said. Julie didn't ask any more questions. She walked inside, opened the bedroom drawer, and pulled out a small black pistol, legally registered in her name. She placed it into her bag, zipped it shut, and left without saying a word. The church was only a 15-minute drive away. Julie parked 2 blocks down and walked. The sanctuary was already halfway through the sermon when she slipped in quietly through the side entrance. The choir was seated. The ushers were still at their posts. Everything looked normal except for the third pew from the front. There he was, Martin Lead, wearing a black hoodie and jeans, his hair longer, face slightly gaunt, but there was no doubt it was him. Julie sat 2 rows behind, just close enough to see the curve of his jaw, the slope of his shoulders, just enough to be sure. She waited. As the pastor began wrapping up the message and inviting people to prayer, Julie stood slowly. She unzipped her bag, withdrew the firearm, and called out his name once, loud enough for everyone to hear. Martin. He turned his head halfway. 2 gunshots echoed through the sanctuary. Panic erupted immediately. Ushers dove. Choir members screamed. Parishioners hit the floor. Julie didn't move. She stood in place, arms lowered, weapon hanging at her side. Martin collapsed where he stood, struck before he had time to process who was behind him. She didn't run. She didn't speak. Julie Lead was arrested inside the sanctuary within minutes of the shooting. She was taken into custody and held without bond. Over the following week, investigators continued piecing together Martin Lead's final movements. They recovered footage from a nearby gas station, placing him in the area 2 days before the church shooting. They also found the journal he had been carrying, a small black notebook with erratic scribbles and a list of names. One of them matched a young woman in the church choir. Her name had been circled several times with words written beside it that would later confirm motive. She gave it to me. She's still singing. According to law enforcement, Martin had returned not for healing or redemption, but to locate the woman he believed had infected him during that party months earlier. She had since joined the church choir. There was no clear plan, but given his history and behavior, it was enough for police to conclude that a second crime was likely hours or even minutes away from occurring. Julie never gave an official statement. She declined media interviews. Her attorney described her as emotionally detached and spiritually numb. When asked if she regretted her actions, she reportedly responded, "There was no choice." Back in DeKalb County, John Lead remained where he had always been, quiet, sick, and disconnected from the world around him. By then, most of the church had distanced themselves from him. The truth had surfaced about the twisted relationship he had once protected. He no longer held any leadership role, and he no longer showed up on Sundays. With both his children gone and his wife behind bars, John faded into silence. Sharon Lead was laid to rest in a private ceremony attended by a handful of extended family and co-workers. Julie, awaiting trial, was not permitted to attend. Raymond Vance stood in for her, delivering a brief eulogy. There were no media outlets, no headlines, just a young woman buried quietly, her story etched in sealed court documents and unspoken grief. The Lead name, once unremarkable, had become synonymous with something far more tragic. What happens when silence hides sickness? When evil is allowed to grow in familiar places? And when justice comes too late to save the innocent? With Martin gone, Sharon buried, and John erased by shame, there was nothing left of the family Julie once fought so hard to hold together. Only decay and silence